Six Figure Developer Podcast, the podcast where we talk about new and exciting technologies, professional development, clean code, career advancement, and more. I'm John Calloway.
I'm Clayton Hunt.
And I'm John Ash.
With us today is Erik St. Martin. Erik is a principal cloud developer advocate at Microsoft and has over 15 years of experience in the industry. He is also the organizer for GopherCon and co-author of Go in Action. Welcome, Erik.
Thanks for having me.
So, Erik, before we get started and sort of the meat of things, would you give our listeners just an introduction to yourself and maybe let them know how you got started in the industry?
Sure. So we already kind of did the intro of where I am today, but I cut my teeth actually in web development. My teenage years, I started getting interested in programming, and web was sort of just taking off then. And I wanted to make my own website. I actually didn't have a formal education in computer science, but I got enough experience as a teenager where by the time the internet really took off, there was no degree for web stuff. They're like, you know how to make these website things, you're hired. That led sort of into about a 5-year stint at Disney, doing all their e-commerce sites. And then I started moving from front end and web development stuff into back-end development, doing systems programming, and then eventually into systems programming. And then in 2014, 2015-ish, when containers sort of hit the scene, that's sort of been where I've been since, contributing to Docker and Kubernetes, building other open source projects in that ecosystem, and kind of working on distributed systems tools. And then at Microsoft specifically, I do a lot of open source development, as well as kind of content and speaking about open source technologies and sort of the vision for the future.
Okay. Could you talk a little bit more about what you're doing today at Microsoft? Sort of what does your maybe typical day look like, or I don't know how you want to kind of answer that, but just trying to give people an idea of sort of what you do in the day-to-day.
Yeah, so there's the typical developer advocacy stuff. And if you're not familiar with how developer advocacy works, the way I like to kind of frame it to people is we had evangelists, and that was very much almost like a technical marketing person, right? I'm going to tell you how great all of our stuff is. And then advocacy is if you flip that around, right? Like if you were to have a child advocate, it's somebody who advocates on behalf of your child, right? So this is the same thing. So developer advocates, we advocate on behalf of the communities we represent. So I'm very much Linux, containers, open source. So I am a lot of times working with product groups to mold products and prioritize features based on what I feel are the needs of the communities I represent. I'll often get to build against some of the technologies in Azure before other people see them. Things like that, provide feedback. On the other side is kind of outward facing, where go out into communities, communicate with people, learn about the types of problems that they're trying to solve, be able to summarize that into, features or general problems that communities are having, and how we might be able to solve those. Some of it is education, containers, very, very big. So I'll go out and give talks on that and kind of how to use Kubernetes as a distributed system. And then I spend a lot of time also doing open source work. So some examples are, if you're familiar with the Kubernetes space, I worked on a project called Virtual Kubelet, which was sort of this idea of like, what if we had a nodeless Kubernetes? And so we get to spike out projects like that. There's some additional things that I'm working on kind of surrounding the idea of using the Kubernetes API server as a framework for building distributed systems, because when we think about the evented nature of it and sort of the reconciliation loops and all of these things, like it has some very, very valuable patterns in it. And if we can just kind of steal that without needing the concept of nodes. And then a more recent one that we're kind of working on, and I don't think it's secret, I hope not now. But we're kind of exploring the idea of like, what if we use Kubernetes as an orchestrator for WASM? So not sticking WASM in a container, but deploying the WASM binaries themselves. So I get to work on some fun stuff where, improving Azure support. And we also get to kind of do these like crazy off the wall ideas that like they could be everything or they could be nothing at all, right?
That sounds pretty fun.
Yeah, and it's definitely a different world being a Microsoft guy and talking about all this open source and community work. So it's a different world that you kind of get to explore and do those types of things. So
and I actually come from the reverse, right? So I work in the Microsoft ecosystem, but my entire career has been open source development. And so like I'm so hardcore of a Linux person. I only in the recent like 3 to 6 months had a Windows computer that was after Windows XP. I was Linux on the desktop, and then I had a Mac for admin stuff. And yeah, probably like somewhere around 3 to 5 months ago, I think I finally decided like, I've been working here for a few years. I should really dog food our stuff, right? Like with VS Code and remote, right? Using the remote functionalities in VS Code and WSL, I'm basically there. Why am I not using this? So it's like I am the target demographic for this. So yeah, I've been mostly a Linux person my whole life.
What's been your opinion of WSL? Because I've really been enjoying it. I kind of came from, again, the Linux open source world. I shifted over several years ago, maybe 6 years ago, where I was now been heavy into the Microsoft area. But I was mostly there because I was learning myself, and there was a lot of content, a lot of open tutorials, a lot of information that's now available in the Microsoft C# platforms and a set and other things. But what has been your opinion of WSL and using it from a day-to-day? Just curious. It's a little bit off topic, but
yeah, I mean, it's totally on topic. It's what we use every day, right? Our development environment. So so I actually love WSL. It is mostly what I develop in now, doing Linux stuff. WSL2 has kind of changed the game. Everything's so much faster with WSL2. If you're running, I think it has to be an insider's build. There is an experimental feature in Docker. So there's a Docker WSL integration where when you're running Docker commands inside your WSL container, it's really running Linux containers on the Windows side. I mean, it's been absolutely fantastic, and I completely forget about it sometimes. And then other times I'm doing remote SSH VS Code sessions to things that are running in Azure, and you almost forget that this is not my machine.
Yeah. No, I've been super impressed with it, and I've been using that insider's build for the WSL2 Docker as well, and just. Yeah, but I think it's one of the best things that Microsoft has done from my perspective, in a while. So,
all right. Before Ash takes us too far down the rabbit hole, so we brought you on to talk a little bit about GoLang. So I wanted to kind of get a little bit of a background with you and GoLang and how you got interested in Go in the first place.
Yeah. So 2009 when it first came out, some coworkers and I at Disney were kind of poking around at it, and we're like, "Wow, this is actually really cool. It's fast," but we didn't really see like a silver bullet. Like, what is it that makes this so great, above and beyond anything else? So then it kind of got put on the shelf for a couple of years, and then I went to work for this startup, which was a credit bureau and fraud detection company, and there was a background service that was written in Go by who you all now know as my friend and business partner, Brian Kettleson. That was like his proof of concept of like this service written in Go. And he was the CIO there at the time. So you know how much time he had to actually work on it. So I went to work for there, and he was like, nobody else wants to learn Go to kind of get this thing in a better state. Do you want to learn Go? And I'm like, sure. Like, I love learning new technologies. And then it was at the point where I actually had to start writing stuff with it that I began to like really, really fall for the language. At the time, I had been on Ruby on Rails, and I was just ecstatic about that and the productivity. And I didn't think anything would pull me away from Ruby. And then it was Go. And that was 2011. So, and there was no Go tool then. You actually had to call the compiler and stuff yourself. So lots of make files. And I think you couldn't delete things out of hash maps. There was a couple weird things I have to look back that didn't exist back then. And pretty much if you wanted to interface with anything, there wasn't a library. You had to write it yourself. that part sucked. But now it's the ecosystem. You can find a library for pretty much anything.
So, and maybe I missed this, but why did they choose Go for that project in the first place?
It was just a language he was interested in. It was a little service that I don't think it had a lot of users at the time. It ended up getting a lot of users, but I think, yeah, it was just a spike. And, even since then, Brian and I are constantly playing with new languages, Nim, Pony, Julia, Ballerina. Like every time there's a new language out, we're playing with it. So that just happened to be his experiment in Go.
All right. So I've thought about looking into Go several times, but I haven't actually gotten around to it. So really all I know is that it's a language that I believe was made by Google. So what kind of language is Go, and what kind of things do you do with Go? Like, graphical or back end, or what is it for?
Yeah. So interestingly, it was created at Google, and the primary team that works on it is still there. And the language was actually created as a systems language to kind of replace things that you would use C for. And you can still very much do that. But the interesting thing that really happened was the people who ended up being drawn to it ended up being your Ruby and Python and Node and PHP type people were like, I'm not getting the performance out of this thing. I need to write this one service in something more performant, but I really don't want to write C or C++. And that industry has really taken off. So the things you will see it most often used for are back-end services, as well as command line tools. And we all know kind of cross-compatibility for command line tools can be really painful. So those are probably the two use cases that it is used for the most. However, people are doing embedded stuff with it. There's new compilers being written for it, like TinyGo, that can compile it for like small, like Arduino-like devices. So yeah, it's really kind of taken on a new life. You've got projects like GoBot, which allow you to kind of do controlling embedded devices as well. I've seen some visualization stuff. There's lots of databases and stuff written in Go. CockroachDB is a really big new database that people are loving. That's written in Go. Docker's written in Go. Kubernetes is written in Go. Almost anything, any tool that you can think of in that container ecosystem is probably written in Go. And any new distributed databases and things like that. Distributed systems have really, really fallen for the language. etcd is written in Go. I'm trying to think. There's probably a massive list of these things. And when you get into like the companies that are using Go, it's actually really surprising too.
So is Go super low level like C or even assembly, or is it a bit more abstracted like Rust or a modern language like Ruby or C# or something?
Yeah, so it's a statically typed language, but syntactically it's very C-like, like a PHP or something like that is close enough to a C. So if you've written languages like that, you're not going to have a big problem understanding it. itself. You don't need to do memory management and things like that like you do in C, though. So it's not as low level as Rust, or, you know, it doesn't get into constructs like ownership and some of these things that Rust has that may be stumbling blocks for new users. Not to dig on Rust, because I've actually been using Rust a bunch lately as well, but kind of comparing languages. If you're a person who's comes from a background that's a Python or Ruby, and you're like, I really don't want to mess with all of this stuff, then yeah, no fear.
Okay, cool.
So a lot of those projects you're mentioning really need some high performant code, and you're really mentioning the performance benefits that that you can get. Is that the main selling feature for Go, or what? Why would someone actually choose Go over something else like C# or
So
wherever?
they try to keep the language very simple, and the interesting thing about simple is actually hard to implement.
Yeah.
So there's not 16 different ways to do the same thing generally, which makes the code very, very readable. It's very, very performant, and gets more so every day because of things they've been implementing into the compiler. And then the concurrency primitives is usually what ends up selling people in that performance side of things, because the way you think about doing threading becomes much easier to reason about than some of, if you think about like futures and promises and things like that are added to languages. So the language itself was designed because most languages have had to plug in concurrency after the fact, because they were invented before you could have multiple threads or multiple processors and things like that. So so it's designed in such a way where that's kind of abstracted from you completely.
How difficult was that to sort of come? So for as a person who's like dealing primarily with, if you will, those languages that have the concurrency bolted on, right? The way that I think about it, how difficult was that a shift from a programmer's standpoint of learning to think in the Go paradigm as opposed to one of these other ones?
It's actually very, very simple. I can explain it in about 5 seconds to give you the kind of abstract way this works. So it's based on a paper called Communicating Sequential Processes. If you're interested in kind of the low level white paper side of things, but effectively you throw out Go routines, which you can think of as threads, except you can have, virtually limitless number of them. You can just throw them out, and those are then multiplexed across the real system threads, and then pinned to threads for various things that require that. But the way you use it is when you make the function call, you just put the word Go in front of it. That spins it up in a thread, and now all you do is you pass data between them using something called a channel, and you can think of that as just a pipe or a queue. You drop something in, and you block waiting for the other thread to pull it off the other side, or you can create effectively a buffered one where you could throw a few messages in so that you wouldn't block until you got it. But that's it. That's the gist of it.
That's pretty cool.
I mean, we can get into things like how do you do non-blocking channels, and there's selects,
right,
and it gets more advanced. But if you want to just wrap your head around how do I do threading, you put Go in front of a function call, and then you pass data between.
Yeah, that's cool.
You're making it sound really easy and appealing.
And there's always things like data races and things, and you can still have mutexes and stuff like that as well. But yeah, that's primarily the way you look at it. Is you're just sending messages off to another thread, and yeah. I would encourage people to learn more about it, because I wouldn't say you're now an expert, but if you want to think about it from an abstract point of view, that's basically how it works.
I've already updated my resume, so we're good.
I have 5 minutes of Go experience. Hire me.
Yeah. So it sounds like Go was designed to solve modern programming problems, and sounds like it may not be that difficult to pick up. So when would you choose to write something in Go, or maybe even rewrite something in Go that was already in another language, instead of sticking with that language or choosing a different language?
Yeah, so 15 years in the industry has also given me the battle wounds of like, let's just rewrite this program, right? Like there's an inherent amount of operational knowledge baked into your application after so many years of maintenance, and you forget about all of those edge cases. So, I wouldn't recommend, Kelsey Hightower one time tweeted something that I absolutely love. He said, legacy means you're making money, right? So, please don't go rewriting all of your apps in Go, because then what happens is it's almost the equivalent of like your iPhone, right? Like if an application starts failing and messing with your phone, the average user is like, my phone is broken. They cannot tell the difference, right? So if I tell you go write all of your stuff in Go, things are going to break, right? Because there's always leaky abstractions. There's things you're going to forget. There's edge cases. And then you're going to have a bad experience, and you're going to be like, Erik, what were you talking about? Go is terrible. So, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, rewriting applications really just means that you're going to take all the existing bugs and introduce your own new ones.
Exactly.
It's a fun process.
So, I mean, if you're looking for, a new project, if you have a new project, or you actually you're suffering, you have problems and performance issues and things like that, and you can't get out of it, out of your application what you need to, then yeah, I mean, Go is definitely the thing I would consider, especially command line tools. Everything, even when I'm playing with other languages, everything I have to write a command line tool for, cross-platform, is just so easy to do to create that. But yeah, any kind of backend services and distributed systems, I think, are really, really, the sweet spot for Go.
And you started mentioning some of the larger, well-known projects that people might not know are written in Go, like Docker and Kubernetes. And I think I saw that HashiCorp has some things written in Go as well. Are there other large projects that people may not be aware of that are written in Go?
So most of HashiCorp stuff is written in Go. Vault, Console, all of those things. If you're a MongoDB person and you're using their CLI tool, that is written in Go. It's become really, really popular. The static site generator Hugo, that is written in Go. There's a lot of crazy projects too. Like PayPal has used Go for like embedded stuff before. It's actually really wild when you start discovering the things that people are using Go for.
Very nice. And I know that a lot of the in-person meetups and conferences these days are being canceled or rescheduled or being moved online and virtual. What has been your experience with GopherCon, and how did that come about?
With kind of how GopherCon was created, or kind of specifically how we're handling everything that's going on now?
Both.
Okay, so at the same company where Brian and I met, where I started using Go, we both kind of fell in love with it, and obviously went to lots of industry events, and it was probably 2012-ish. Brian and I were complaining to each other like, I wish there was a Go conference. And then 2013, there were more complaints. And then around May of 2013, there was somebody, I think, from the Denver Go meetup group said something similar. And we were both replying like, I know, right? We keep saying this. And then the response was something along the lines of like, why don't you guys create one? And Brian and I had about a 30-second conversation. We're like, how hard could it be, right? It turns out actually really hard. But yeah, we expected, we were hoping for a minimum of 100, maybe a maximum of 200, 250 people. our first year. It turned out that everybody wanted to Go conference just as bad as we did. And we had 750 people our very first year.
Wow.
Nice.
Whoa.
12 or 1300 year two. I'd have to look at the numbers again, but yeah, it just exploded. It turned out that Go was was a big deal, and that was mid 2013. The conference occurred in April of 2014.
Wow.
And yeah, that was history. And then people started asking us, can we create a conference called Go for Con 2? And we're like, yeah. We didn't know it would be the Go conference. At the time, I think we were always waiting for somebody to come around and do a bigger, better one, because to us, we were just two programmers who tripped and fell into conference organizing.
So how has the recent struggles kind of impacted Go for Con this year?
Yeah, so if you know any conference organizers, give them a hug. Well, not yet. After the social distancing is over, but yeah, send them an email or a DM and tell them how much you appreciate them, because I don't think people realize the amount of work and stress that can come into conference organizing. And just sort of like an opening up the curtain a little bit thing. So as all of the events and stuff started canceling, we were in late June, so we were like, okay, this things could clear up. At the time, we had certain world leaders saying like, this will be over before we know it. So we were kind of following the guidance of the CDC and the WHO. So we were still kind of waiting to see. However, you end up where these types of things can trigger impossibility clauses, but only if your dates are affected. If you cancel or even don't have the attendance because of things like this, at the time this hit, we were sitting with over $700,000 in unbooked hotel rooms that we are liable for. So yeah, people don't realize that, like, you book a hotel room block for these conferences and you are saying we will pay for it if people don't book these rooms. And so things like this occur, and some people in the short term will be triggered by impossibility clauses and will likely be able to get out of it. But you still, let's just think about the basics of it. If a bunch of people buy tickets and then you have to issue refunds, you are already in the negative, even if you didn't spend $1 of it on deposits or anything, because you paid commissions to your credit card processor. So yeah, it's a wild ride and it's super stressful. Thankfully, I mean, we're handling our stuff, and rescheduling and all of that. We still have, obviously, our stresses of all of that, and we're still trying to figure out all of it. But we're looking to reschedule later in the year, hopefully, if things free up. But the Go team at Google has also, for most of, I think, the smaller conferences that have been impacted, have kind of stepped up to try to help make sure that they don't sink, because things like that can end a conference, right?
Wow. Yeah.
Like, Brian and I have had some good careers and we make good money and, some investments and things like that. But I don't have $700,000 to drop on hotel rooms. So yeah, so those types of things can actually make, people go insolvent, and then, it never happens again. So, I'm grateful for Google and some of the other sponsors that I've seen, not just for Go conferences, but other conferences that are sort of, stepped up to the plate to help with those things, and to, say, hey, no matter what happens, like, keep the sponsorship money. We already had that kind of earmarked,
Yeah.
So, but okay. Yeah. Send love to conference organizers, because they're not sleeping right now.
Yeah. Thanks for going through that for us. How about resources to people who might be wanting to get started in Go? Do you have any resources or anything that you would direct people to?
Yeah, so there used to be a really big list of those things, but the Go team recently released go.dev, which has like all of the things I probably would have sent you to there. If you go under, what's the name of the tab? I think it's called Learn, and it'll list books and websites and tutorials and things like that. And the Go playground is really fun. You can walk through kind of exercises right there in your browser without having to install anything too. Although I do wish we had a Rustlings, because that was cool.
Okay. And then to sort of like close in a different direction, one of the things we ask all of our guests that come on is to sort of speak to our listeners who are just getting started in the industry, or trying to give themselves a leg up. Is there any specific kind of words of wisdom or piece of advice that you would give those folks directly?
I'm more of a stick to your interests person. I think when you find things that you are passionate about, even when they're not necessarily big yet, you often find success there, because it's very easy to drill in really hard and focus and lose a lot of hours in it if you're passionate about it. If you're picking an area of the industry just because you think that's where you're going to be most successful, it's going to be a long, and it's just you're going to get drained, and it's crazy how fast these come, right? Like 2011, I don't know how many Go developers there were in the world, but probably 10,000 or something, right? Like, I had no way of knowing that Go would become as big. And the same thing with containers. They were technologies that as a developer I found very, very fascinating. And often, if they're fascinating to you and can solve a lot of your problems, they can solve a lot of other people's problems too. So I think, do the stuff that you're passionate about, because that's going to be the part that matters, And even when you get to a certain degree of success, that's actually what you start trying to do, right? You get up there and you get your senior title or your principal title, and you're like, sweet, I don't want to do any of the monotonous stuff anymore. I want to do the stuff I'm excited about. Why not do that from the beginning?
Nice. If anyone wanted to sort of reach out to you or kind of contact you, hear from you, what would be the best way for them to do that? Is there a particular social media for them to do that with?
Yeah, I mean, if you're already in the Go world or Kubernetes world, you can find me on the Gopher Slack and the Kubernetes Slack. Otherwise, DM me on Twitter. It's my full name, Erik St. Martin, no punctuation, no spaces, all jammed together. Or you can shoot me an email at erik@erik.dev.
Cool.
All right. Thanks, Erik. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
That was Erik St. Martin. Erik is a principal cloud developer advocate at Microsoft and has over 15 years of experience in the industry. He is also the organizer for GopherCon and co-author of Go in Action.
If you like this episode, please like, rate, and review on iTunes.
Find show notes, blog posts, and more at sixfiguredev.com.
And be sure to follow us on Twitter at sixfiguredev.
This has been another episode of the Six Figure Developer Podcast, helping others reach their potential. I am John Calloway.
I'm Clayton Hunt.
And I'm John Ash.